It's been a while since I've done one of these, and I don't think there's a better way to bring it back than analysing one of the most interesting levels of the year so far. Weak Air was a bit of a surprise to me. I had never heard of the creator before, and probably the only reason I know about this level now is because Nooblicking Pro told me about it. Nevertheless, after watching the verification video, it instantly became one of my favourite levels in the game, and that shouldn't surprise you if you know anything about my aesthetic taste. Weak Air is very clearly a mixing pot of a lot of different styles, and yet despite that it still manages to be very original in its own right, although sometimes it does feel a little lacking in comparison to the levels it takes inspiration from. For example, the second part exhibits the unique structuring that you would expect from a level inspired by Want Me, but I feel that the composition is a little off in comparison to that level. I think the level utilises these half blocks far beyond what looks comfortable on the screen, and the lack of any real air deco means the block structuring feels a bit messy. Another type of structure to fill in non-gameplay areas would have worked wonders for the variation and composition here. Starting off with a criticism like this probably sounds weird after just calling this one of my favourite levels, but I wanted to get it out of the way so that I could address everything I really like about this part in particular. One of the major highlights here is the colours. I've talked about rainbows being a pretty uninteresting and obvious choice before, but here it works quite well with the song, and the Neige for style gradients prevent it from being too monochrome or boring. The pulses do pretty much the same thing, and one thing I especially appreciate is the pulses from the default saturated blocks to much more desaturated ones. It doesn't work so well in the wave when most of the blocks are grey rather than coloured, but it shows how attention to detail in the sync and colouring really helps to boost the level's overall atmosphere and creativity. This creativity carries over to the midsection as well, particularly in the structuring. Anyone who's tried a non-abstract design style will tell you how difficult it is to create a good slope design. But WonderFox demonstrates that perhaps the best route is simplism, using only a few objects to make up the main part of their blocks. Although it is obviously a less complex design, the pulses are once again superb and fully make up for it, especially these excellent ones in the spider. The mini spikes also add a little bit of detail, and their colour makes them pop out against the otherwise fairly monochrome section. I have to say the effects are a little lackluster in this part, essentially consisting of some moving arrows and pulsing circles. You could argue that, like the block designs, they're simple on purpose, but the issue here is that there isn't really anything interesting going on in the colours to help boost the effects like there is in the designs. Instead of working with a combination of several colours or creating a gradient, the background pulses one solid colour every time, and the actual choice of colour isn't great either. It's understandable that they didn't want to keep it grey throughout, as it would have felt pretty jarring after the most colourful part in the level, but I think some sort of extra colour effect behind the moving arrows would have increased the colour depth and not made the pulses feel so strange. All in all, this is a pretty minor complaint though, when contrasted against the genuinely brilliant structuring and the excellent use of colour in the blocks. And while I did feel it was worth mentioning, it really doesn't bring the part or the level down by much at all. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the last part, which is probably my least favourite in terms of decoration quality. The main problem is a lack of good execution to match the interesting ideas. For example, the pulses from block to outline are a very cool way to break up the otherwise static nature of the colours, but unfortunately the weird structuring leaves little room for any real designs to pop out as a result of the pulses, and the lack of opacity changes on objects that should definitely have some mean that the part feels very flat colour-wise. The black bars also look quite strange, and even though they match the song, that and the black flashes seem to not really have any other purpose than to obscure the already difficult gameplay. Even though it's my least favourite part, the final section still has a lot of really cool details that give it a solid place in the level, which goes to show that the overall quality of this level is still very high. The structuring doesn't do the design any favours, as I said, but the use of slopes is actually very unique, if seeming a little random at points, and perhaps with a bit more work and composition, the pulses could have really shone. Once again, the effects are very simple, but they work well with the song, and in this part there's really no need to make up for a lack of colour depth, given that all the elements are on completely opposite sides of the contrast spectrum. Of course, I wouldn't talk about this part without discussing the use of restricted space, a design choice that works very well with the much more closed off feeling of the song and builds tension up to the ending. Although the transition into it might have been improved by the platform on top of the player moving up to fit the space, rather than just fading into position, this part still creates a lot of potential for unique gameplay, on which it follows through quite well. Speaking of, the gameplay in this level is pretty fantastic, at least to watch. Each part works very well with whatever part of the song it's using, and the gameplay has surprising depth if you look into it a bit more on a replay or a rewatch. For example, the harsh drums you hear in the middle two parts are matched quite well to the stiff nature of the gameplay, particularly in the rainbow section. But once the drums fade away in the last part, the gameplay becomes ironically pretty free-flowing, allowing for orb momentum to carry out and sync with the song in a lot of parts. Something else I wanted to talk about was the attention to detail beyond just syncing to the music. One particular thing that just floored me when I first saw this level was this string of orbs in the bull part. I know it's really nothing significant, but I love little gameplay details like these. They just make playing or watching the level far more interesting than it would be otherwise. Admittedly, the level is not particularly fun in parts, and I especially had an issue with mistiming the orbs in the ship, because fitting through the gaps in the blocks is quite tricky to get down. Due to the odd nature of the gameplay, the midsection also feels a little rough because of having to remember the one way to do each click. Figuring out gameplay quirks and timings is one of the most fun parts of learning a level for me, but this level takes it a little too far, to the point where some parts become inconsistent. This last part in particular has a problem with being quite awkward, especially with the aforementioned decoration trying to block you from seeing your player's movement at any point in time. Something else I'm not particularly happy about is the use of a nong, and I'd like to take this video as a platform to talk about my thoughts on using songs outside of Newgrounds generally. In my opinion, Geometry Dash levels do not constitute fair use, meaning I don't find nongs to be a good choice morally or legally. While some might say that you're adding to the music by creating a product with it, I don't think that's enough to claim that you don't need to pay for a license like everyone else. Think of the level as an additional layer on top of the song, rather than weaving in and out in the same fashion as something like a review. Perhaps the most relevant comparison is a dance routine. The dance is synced to the music, the song isn't just being played without anything being added to it, and there's a very obvious visual aspect to the performance. But dance studios still need to license the songs they use or risk incurring huge fines. Obviously, public dances are a lot more mainstream than Geometry Dash levels, meaning copyright holders are far more likely to want to take action when dance studios illegally use their music. But that doesn't mean that creators have an excuse to not at least ask for permission to use the song, and if the artist says no or doesn't reply, simply don't use it. I have to say that WonderFox is nowhere near the level of someone like Jake is in this regard. The level contains no other copyrighted material other than the song, and they did make sure to make it clear what the song is and who wrote it. I'm quite nervous about publicly sharing my opinion on this, given that within the GD community this is a very controversial opinion, which is most likely because there's never been a court case about this specifically, meaning there's no real precedent for this type of thing. Personally, I just don't see the point of using a song you don't have a license or permission to use, and possibly getting in legal trouble just so you can make a Geometry Dash level, especially when there's a bank of over 1 million songs on Newgrounds from artists that can specifically opt in or out of usage in the game. Perhaps less controversially, another problem for this getting rated is that the replacement song is not synced that well at all. This is not really an issue for me, considering the only people likely to beat this are going to be able to replace a song, but I can definitely see it being a problem for others, particularly Rob. As a result of the song issues, there's no real way this could get epic, and some would even be reluctant to see it be featured. However, there's no denying that the decoration quality is unique and superb in most parts, and I personally would be very happy with this getting a feature. I'm not completely positive about supporting WonderFox's future works in terms of song use, if they continue doing what they did here, but I really hope I can see a lot more excellent and unique decoration as they develop the style in the coming months or years.